Okay, now I want to talk to you about the concept of a covered query. Now, a covered query is not a query that is covered by a house, but instead it's a query where the query itself can be satisfied entirely with an index, and hence 0 documents need to be inspected to satisfy the query. Now, if you can satisfy a query entirely from the index, that's going to make the query a lot faster. Let's go through an example in the shell to see how it works. All right, I have a collection that I call numbers that has 1,000,000 documents in it. And it was just put in here with a nested loop of I, j, and k. So pretty straightforward. And if we look at numbers and we see what the indexes are on it, we see that there are in fact 2 indexes. There's an index on _ID, and there's an index on I, j, k. Those are the only indexes. So let's see how we would create a query and find out whether it's covered. So I'm going to create an explainable object, var exp equals db.numbers.explain. And I'm going to use the execution stats level of output. Now we're going to use that object to call find, and we're going to look for something where I is 45, j is 23, and that's it. And let's see what that produces. So this is our explain output. Actually, before we look at that, let's just go back and see what the actual result would be of that. Give it a little bit more context. You can see that if we gave that query, we'd get a bunch of documents with I, j, and k, and an _ID. And looking at the explain output and going up into the execution stats part, we see that there were 100 documents that were returned, and that's right here. And you can see that there were 100 documents examined, and you can see there were 100 keys examined. So if documents were examined, that doesn't sound like a covered index. And the question is, since there was an index on IJK, and since we only asked to see IJK, why is it that this query had to actually look at the documents? Doesn't make a lot of sense. And you can see that it did use an index scan here, and that it used the IJK index. And the reason is that we also asked to see _ID. And _ID is not included in that index, and so it had to go to the documents to actually return the result. Let's change the query a little bit and specifically project out _ID 0, I1, J1. Now we're saying we want to see the I and J values, and we don't want to see the _ID value. We can also see the K value. That won't change the result in this case, because this is an index in IJK. Now if we did that query, and we look at the execution stats again in this explain output, we see that once again we got 100 documents out. But this time, the number of total keys examined is 100, but the number of total documents examined is 0. And when the number of total documents examined is 0, and we use an index and we return results, we have a number of documents returned that's greater than 0, that's a covered query. And this query was covered by that index entirely. And if we ran the query without the explain, db.numbers.find, we would see that we're returning only the results for I, j, and k, and no _ID values. And therefore, we can satisfy this entirely with the index. Now here's a slightly surprising result, which is that if we call this query like this, where we suppress the _ID right here, and are silent on the other options, we get pretty much the exact same output. This is exactly the same output. But if you do an explain of this query, I'm going to find on the explainable object with the same query, where I and j is specified, and the _ID is suppressed, we're going to find that, in fact, if we go to the top of the execution stats, 100 documents were examined, and 100 keys were examined, and 100 documents were returned. So what's going on here? That seems kind of weird. And it's a little subtle. But the issue is that with this query, where we suppress _ID, but are silent on what we want to do with the other keys in the document, MongoDB needs to inspect every document because it doesn't know if there's another key in a document. There could be an L or a P key in a document. It doesn't know for sure that it could satisfy this query with just the IJK index. Only in the case where you project exactly what's in the index, or I should say a subset of what's in the index, and if it's an index that doesn't include _ID, then _ID has to be suppressed. It's only in the case where the index can completely satisfy the query with certainty that it's covered and the database can avoid looking at the documents. If there's any possibility of having to present the value for a key that's not in the index, then it can't just stick with the index. It has to go to the documents. All right, now it is time for a quiz. We'd like to perform a covered query on the example collection. And this example collection, it's called example, and it's right here. It has these indexes. Which of the following is likely to be a covered query? Check all that apply.